So welcome to the online lecture finishing up on the educational aptitude and achievement testing. So primarily speaking, we're going to finish up looking at problems with educational assessments and some other issues when we're looking at educational tests. As a reminder that we will have class coming up in the computer lab, and that your next test is coming up fairly soon, and the study guide is available online in Blackboard. So some of the problems with educational assessments is, again, we're making a lot of decisions based on educational tests, both achievement tests, looking to see if people are at the proper level based on usually national norms for various skill sets that we're assuming that they will be gaining through the educational process, or aptitude, so their general ability to learn new information. One of the issues with educational assessment is the idea of teaching to the test. So once a test becomes established as a way to mark progress, so we're using these assessments to determine are students at various grades getting the skills necessary to continue on to the next grade and to be competitive on a national kind of level. That a lot of times these tests then also are tied to financial outcomes. So some schools, actually, the amount of funding they get is based on the number of students that are passing these educational assessments. Also, a lot of times, teachers' performance is tied to whether or not their classes are performing well on these tests. Therefore, as the test is used over and over again, knowledge starts to get out there as far as what's actually on the test, and you can now have teachers that are no longer teaching broad content, but are specifically focusing on the skills and the knowledge that they know is going to be on that test, because it reflects better on their school for funding and better on them for teaching evaluations. And that's a problem, because now we're not necessarily measuring a broad sampling of achievement. We're specifically, now the test itself is basically reducing the quality of the education that it's meant to assess. We've already kind of discussed cultural bias, so regional, language, ancestral, social economic status. So all of these have been found to have some effect on success in the test. So if we have any national norms, that's going to be an average across the nation, which means some areas are going to excel on that test, and some areas are going to really struggle with that test. Language issues, specifically language wording, can be a problem in cultural bias. And cultural bias doesn't necessarily mean just culture as in ethnicity or race. It can also be, again, regional, geographical. So what you call a carbonated beverage can change from region to region. Some areas call it a Coke, some call it a pop, some call it a soda. So even that, if you encounter a word that you don't necessarily recognize, for example, in the Northeast of the United States, a water fountain is often referred to as a bubbler. If I got a question from someone that wrote a test about and was just trying to basically put some local flavor or kind of provide a context for their question, and they were talking about someone going and getting a drink at a bubbler, there's a good chance a couple of years ago I would have had no idea what they were talking about. The only reason I know that a water fountain is also called a bubbler is I actually had a close friend that was from northern Wisconsin, and they used the term, and I said, what does that mean? So again, that's just a small kind of silly example, but language can create differences in how people can interpret a test. Basically, again, ancestral is really referring to kind of the culture and your ancestors, but also the past history within your own family as far as focus on education. So a lot of times students that are the first generation college students actually have been found to have some fairly strong challenges in taking standardized educational assessments, because their family, their ancestry, doesn't necessarily have a long history of encountering these tests. So, for example, when I had to take my first educational assessment, both of my parents were very familiar with these kinds of tests. They had taken them, so they could give me information about those tests. And again, social economic status. Beyond these cultural biases, there has been more specifically evidence that these tests do have an ethnic bias, that various ethnic groups perform better or worse on various parts of these kind of tests. And again, we have to ask, from a social justice viewpoint, is that actually giving us the information we then want from these tests? Also, a little bit of a lack of accountability in these tests. So, where they're coming from, how they're being used. There's a lot of accusations. So, teachers versus parents, parents versus students, students versus government. There's a lot of adversarial roles that are going on with these educational assessments. So, basically, if a student does well on one of these, there's not a lot of problems. The parents don't complain, the teachers are seen as doing their jobs, the students are happy with the tests, and the government gets the information it needs about performance. But when a student does poorly on this test, there's often a whole process of possibly parents complaining, teachers responding to those complaints, students complaining, and then actual government outcomes, negative outcomes as far as funding. As we do more and more assessments, as we're getting more and more people into the educational system, a part of that also is that if we're trying to measure successful achievement in school, we're also needing to make sure that the actual interventions we're measuring with these assessments, and remember in this case, interventions is the actual education, is adequate, that it's being taught by qualified teachers, and also these tests are being administered by qualified teachers. And that's another issue, that in some of these educational systems, there are less qualified teachers or teachers that are misusing the tests. We do tend to find grade inflation, and what that means is that a lot of areas we find schools where all of the students are generally considered to be doing well, where children are being passed to appease parents, and that also students are being given additional help for behavioral and attention problems. And again, all of these are often done in a way to try to make it look like the educational intervention, the education the kids are getting, is better than it actually is. So, criticism in educational testing, there has been, educational testing kind of goes through cycles, if you will. At some periods in time, it has been very well received, at others it's not. Currently, we're in a phase of definitely there's been some criticism and some political dislike of all of the educational testing that's occurring within our system. It's pretty easy to get all political opinion, especially from educators, if you mention the government's No Child Left Behind program, which involves using educational assessments to determine what kind of funding various schools are getting. So a Phi Delta Kappa Gallup poll recently found that 31% of Americans believe that there is too much emphasis on achievement tests. In other words, this was a problem in organizations and that schools were spending too much time focusing on these tests and teaching for these tests. 43% said that these tests should not determine promotion or graduation. They shouldn't be used for making decisions on whether a student advances to the next grade or whether they graduate. And 66% said that tests should evaluate the instruction, not the achievement. In other words, if we're going to do educational testing and we're going to actually determine whether a school is getting funding or if teachers are assumed to be doing a good job, we should be actually evaluating the instructors and their instruction, not necessarily the student's achievement. And partly this is done because there has been some evidence that it's a poor predictor of behavior. So there is a relationship between these achievement tests and other grades and success in school. However, it's not a very good relationship. So they're not highly predictive of, for example, whether that student is misbehaving or not, whether that student's doing well as far as their actual grades. The results can often be misinterpreted and misused, so used with the wrong norms. So if you're using national norms for schools across the country, you're going to find geographical effects, where some schools where they have a lot of funding, a lot of high SES students, a lot of students coming from families that are used to having testing being done, that are used to really pressing for education, those students are all going to be actually graded as doing incredibly well on the test, whether or not the education they're getting is actually of high quality. And likewise, students in areas with lower SES and lower access to those kind of experiences, even if the teaching there is better, may be underperforming on the tests. And that's misinterpretation and misuse of the actual test scores. Confidentiality of results are problematic, so trying to actually protect the confidentiality of the students. A lot of schools actually will make decisions that make it very clear how people did on the test, so using these tests to determine who goes into advanced placement or possibly also special education classes. The tests themselves for quick grading are usually completely in a forced choice format, which also only can measure certain types of achievement. Coaching on tests is definitely an issue. At this point, our testing culture is solid enough that there are multiple programs that students or their parents can pay for to basically coach students on how to take the test. And in a lot of educational systems, especially in the systems that know that the performance on these tests actually determine some of their funding, a lot of times the instructors, the teachers, will spend time in class not teaching content, but teaching how to do well on the tests. And research has also found there is some inconsistency over time. So, though there is a general amount of data that these tests are somewhat related to performance in school and later performance in life, it also seems to vary from year to year, especially with tests that aren't being normed and basically rewritten on a regular basis. So, other issues include cheating. So there's various security measures to try to prevent cheating, but some of these actually fall on the schools that are administering the tests. So once again, qualified teachers can become an issue of, do you have teachers that are qualified to make sure cheating isn't occurring on the test? Identifying potential cheaters is one of the things that some research has been done. So how can you actually, and some of these tests now have items that specifically are made to be very difficult to get unless you are cheating. And they basically have a built-in cheating index that they can use to determine if there's statistical evidence that the students are performing out of the range that would be expected of normal achievement. And it's not just students that are actually cheating. There has been numerous scandals where schools, to defend their funding or to defend their teaching choices, the teachers they've hired, have actually been found to be altering tests, giving student answers, providing additional correct sheets into the pool that students didn't actually take. So cheating can definitely be an issue, especially when you've attached dollar signs to the outcomes of these tests. Another part of this, Cannell talks about the Lake Wobegon effect, and the idea behind this is, generally speaking, normally functioning people, adults, humans, have a tendency to actually have a more rosy view of the world than the reality. So when we ask people to rate how well they are doing, so for example in 1988, 70% of U.S. students said that they were above average. So that is a belief that more people than is statistically possible are actually better than the average. Because in reality, only 50% of students should be above average, because average is 50% of performance. So the effect occurs also statistically. So if you don't norm the test enough, remember with the intelligence test, the Flynn effect. As tests are reused over and over and over again, there's a natural tendency for people's scores to continue to go up. So if you have a test that's been normed 10 to 15 years ago, you're going to start finding not only are students thinking they're above average, the test scores are going to find the vast majority of students are, quote-unquote, above average. Again, now if we're using these kind of tests to try to make a determination of comparing the schools to other schools, determine schools that are students that actually need interventions, we've got a problem. Again, coaching and teaching towards the test also increases those test scores. So if the norm is created off of samples, often actually conducted by the actual organization that creates the test, those are usually done in optimal situations where testing is near impossible. Now the test is being sent into schools where teachers are administering, where coaching may happen, cheating may happen. So again, the performance also will increase. Not following standardized procedures, so letting students take longer for the test than they're supposed to, letting students take the test in an isolated room where cheating is more possible, letting the students take the test with notes when they're not supposed to. And, as I said, there's been instances found in basically legal challenges where even teachers have gone back, got the answer sheets, taken out an eraser, and added right answers. And again, we already talked about teaching from the test. So all of these effects end up kind of biasing the results that we're getting from these achievement tests by basically creating a greater than 50% of sample that's actually above the norms, which makes the test harder to use for what it's intended. So some other tools for assessment in educational setting, and there has been a strong move to some of these as a reaction against the kind of the achievement test problems. One is basically called it's all lumped together, but performance assessment is any type of assessment that requires the examinee to do more than choose the correct response. So basically, performance assessment can be portfolio, authentic assessment. There's a lot of different terms, but it means that they're actually putting together essay questions, short answers. So we're getting away from multiple choice, which also means we're getting away from something that can be easily scored with a computer. There may be providing writing samples, research proposals. They may be doing a performance task, so a work sample designed to elicit representative knowledge, skills, and values of a particular domain of study. So, for example, it might be, instead of simply asking math questions that have multiple choice questions, giving a complex math problem that the student actually has to work through at multiple levels. Or having a student read a passage from a research article and then provide a 2-page summary of what information was in there and what the implications were. These would be performance tasks. A performance portfolio is usually, and portfolios are also very commonly being used as a replacement for achievement tests. This means that a student actually chooses to put together a collection of their own works from the various classes they've had to represent the arc or the narrative of what they've learned. So if you were going to create a portfolio for your time at SIUE, you would be including papers and written assignments and maybe examples of things you had turned in at the freshman level, 100 level classes, 200 level classes, 300 level classes, and finally, the majority of 400. And the idea behind this then is that portfolio would create a narrative of how you had improved over those 4 years based on the intervention, the education we provide at SIUE. And actually, the SIUE has been using a portfolio system to try to measure and track undergraduate success and assessment. So we've been measuring various students, usually volunteer students, by having them create these portfolios and then having a group of faculty members grade the portfolios. Now, the downside of these methods, they're highly detailed. You get rich information about whether or not the student's learning, but they also require a considerable amount of expertise to grade. And you also don't have national norms, so it's hard to compare a school's performance to other schools. So portfolio assessment is a form of performance assessment that refers to the evaluations of one's work samples. So when we're talking about portfolios, that's what we were just talking about on the previous slide. This idea of the student, or possibly even someone that is a mentor of that student, will help to put together an example of various works. Portfolio assessment is often very much used in the arts. So, for example, in fine art drawing, I took a class and my final grade was my portfolio, and it was a folder with all of the various pieces of art that I had produced throughout the last 4 months. Authentic assessment in an educational content is an evaluation of relevant, meaningful tasks that may be conducted to evaluate the learning of an academic subject matter, but that demonstrate the student's transfer to the study of the real-world activities. So authentic assessment means that if one of the things that we're hoping that you learn in the 4 years here at SIUE is critical thinking, then instead of simply giving you 10 items on a multiple choice test about critical thinking, instead of assessing a paper that you wrote about critical thinking, we actually provide a real-world problem that requires critical thinking and then grade the actual output. So again, these are trying to get away from these national norm tests. They're trying to get away from assessment that's based on tests that can easily then be cheated on and can also be taught towards. But when we move to these other forms, we're also losing that ability to norm, to take an idea of how well the school is doing compared to other schools. It's possible, but it requires a lot of grading rubrics and standardization, because both of these methods, portfolio assessment and authentic assessment, require experts to be grading the materials. So other tools of assessment in educational settings, so that's not the only thing that we can do to try to measure assessment. So we talked about measuring achievement with nationally normed tests. We talked about measuring aptitude, especially moving into like predicting how well someone will do in higher education. And we've now talked about some alternatives to those kind of assessments, specifically looking at, for example, portfolio assessment or authentic assessment. There are other markers or outcomes of success in educational settings. We can measure study habits, measure interests, measure aptitudes, and again, more like career aptitudes. So academic performance is the result of a complex interplay of a number of factors. And even the strongest relationships between achievement and GPA, motivation and GPA, study time and GPA, each one of these is really only capturing a small percentage of the total variance in grade performance. So if you want to predict how well someone is going to do in school, you want to know, are they going to be an A student? An achievement test or an aptitude test is going to be related, but it's not going to explain all the variance. In other words, some students are going to be basically scoring very highly on an achievement test, like the Wechsler Intelligence Scale, or maybe like an aptitude test like the ACT, but still get B's and C's because they're distracted, they like to go out and party, they don't attend their classes, they're not very motivated. And likewise, a very motivated student that spends a lot of time studying may do much better than would be predicted by an achievement or aptitude test. Which means if we really want to get at performance in educational setting, we need to be measuring these other possible predictors of performance. A number of tools have been created to try to gather more information on these factors. There's the study habit checklist. Basically, again, the more things, it's a behavioral checklist, and the more things you check, yes, I do that, yes, I do that, the more likely you are to perform better in classes, regardless of your aptitude or achievement. What I like to do, interest inventories, generally basically are pretty good at predicting whether or not you will be engaged in various material. So these will be asking you a bunch of questions of what do you actually enjoy. And for example, if a lot of the questions you say, I like to solve number problems, I like number puzzles, that means that person would be predicted, regardless again of achievement or aptitude, to do better in math classes because they'd find them more interesting. Survey of school attitude, so your opinion of school. If you have a very positive opinion of education, of schools in general, and the value of education, again, regardless of your achievement or aptitude scores, you're going to do better in school than someone that's suspicious of school or thinks that school is a conspiracy to change their attitudes or has no use. Quality of school life scales. So the more you're enjoying your life in general, in other words, you have a balanced life. You are getting to spend time with friends. You're getting the chance to relax. You're being able to handle your stress while being in school, again, is a predictor of success in classes. Someone, again, even that has high aptitude or achievement who is struggling with stress, doesn't have a lot of social support, is going to do worse in their classes. And there's combinations. So surveys of study habits and attitudes, study attitudes and method surveys. There's a lot of different ways to get at this, but I did want to just end up on this lecture that there are multiple ways to get at the construct of educational success.